Welcome to Creepy and Geeky, the double feature podcast of horror and more. I'm your host, Robert, and today is the second episode in my werewolf series. On today's episode, Molly Henery joins me to talk about Teen Wolf and Ginger Snaps. Molly is a film critic, entertainment writer, and author of both fiction and nonfiction. Molly writes horror film reviews for her own website, The Blogging Banshee, and for other outlets, including Fangoria, Dread Central, Nightmarish Conjurings, and more. She is most well known for her uterus horror column on Certified Forgotten, which examines a different film each month in a subgenre of horror Molly named and defined. Molly also co-authored the upcoming book, Queer Horror, a Film Guide. Welcome to the show, Molly.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you on. So today we are going to be talking Teen Wolf and Ginger Snaps, and I know Ginger Snaps is one of your, if not your favorite horror movie ever. So that should be a lot of fun. But first, I want to get to what was your first horror movie?
My first horror movie was actually the original A Nightmare on Elm Street when I was 4 years old.
Okay, that's a great time for that.
Yes, that's I don't know if it's necessarily a benefit, but it's one of the effects of having a sister who's 9 years older than you babysitting you.
Right.
Bad things are bound to happen.
So did that start a lifelong love affair with horror at that point, or was that something, or was it something gradual that happened along the way?
No, I think it definitely was like the thing that really sparked my love of horror, because obviously, I mean, I was 4. I was absolutely terrified.
Right.
Very traumatic experience, but of that trauma, like I kind of started to seek out more horror stuff, even kid-friendly horror. Like obviously I grew up watching Hocus Pocus and
Right.
Nightmare Before Christmas and stuff like that. But also I would seek out like the Thriller music video. And every time we would go back then where I lived, we had Hollywood Video was our video store. So
Right.
whenever we went to Hollywood Video, I would always browse the horror section. And my parents at first tried to keep me from those kinds of things and censor me a little bit, but they very quickly gave up on that. And I basically got to have free reign and watch whatever I wanted from a very young age.
That's good. Yeah. I grew up in the 80s, and so yeah, whenever we got stuff from the video store, my parents were pretty permissive for that kind of stuff. So I didn't have any restrictions really on any kind of horror movies. So that it was kind of nice, So I get
Gives
to
you
grow
more
up during
opportunity to
the
explore.
yeah, and I grew up during the the 80s boom of the slashers. So that was a it was an interesting education. All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump into Teen Wolf. This speaking of the 80s, this one was a it's a classic of the of werewolf cinema. In a lot of ways, it's more on the comedy side. It's not really horror so much. Although there are a few minor horror touches here and there. It's mostly a comedy, a vehicle for Michael J. Fox along his path to stardom. So, when did you first see this, and how did you see it?
I've been trying to remember the first time I saw it, and I honestly can't remember the specific moment. I think it was most likely something, because I don't remember ever renting it or anything like that. I'm fairly certain it was just something that I came across on TV one day.
Right.
And I think it was probably when I was in high school was when I saw this one. Uh, and I mean, I obviously like grew up watching movies like Back to the Future, so I love Michael J. Fox. I've always been a big fan of his. And but it's so weird that this just wasn't one that I necessarily ever sought out, but it's one that
Right.
I've always known about. And like, even though I don't remember the specific moment, it's one that I always think about when I think of like werewolf movies, and when I think about movies that I love that kind of combine those horror elements as well as the comedy elements, because it's when you think of horror comedies, it's most likely one of the first ones that you think of. You know what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, it's so funny. I just, no matter how much I rack my brain, I cannot think of the specific moment that I saw it, but it definitely was something that I just came across on TV. I don't think until I rewatched it for this, I had never rented it in my life.
That's funny. Yeah. No, yeah, I remember seeing it pretty fairly early in the 80s. I don't think I saw it at the theater, but I probably saw it on cable or video sometime around the time that they came out. But it's yeah, it's definitely one of those ones. It was very popular in the 80s. Um, but it's one of those ones that I think has lost a little bit of its luster, not like a lot. I think people look back on it fondly, but I don't think it's one people go back to all that often. I don't hear it brought up all that often. And I think, especially in horror circles, I think because it leans more into the comedy side than the horror side of things, that I think that's, people kind of regard it more in that comedy vein.
Yeah.
Um,
And it's interesting because when you think of comedies from the 80s versus horror from the 80s, the horror has aged a lot better than the comedies.
yeah, I would say fairly, for the most part, yeah. Because a lot of 80s comedies were kind of it was this transitory period where they were still kind of getting away with stuff like, very sexist, sometimes racist
Mhm.
material that as the later 80s, early 90s started to kind of transition away from that, sensibility started to mature in comedy and kind of sort of get away from that. So yeah, you do have that. I can see where comedies for sure did not age well for that era. So
Yeah, lots of
yeah,
jokes about like, oh, I at one point I'm pretty sure he says something along the lines of saying like, I'm not a fag or something like that.
yeah,
And it's
yeah,
and it's something that it's when you watch stuff like this, you understand that it's of that era,
right, yeah,
but it still makes it kind of unfortunate to watch. I mean,
yeah.
even comedies that don't have the horror elements, like I was someone who didn't see 16 Candles until just a couple years ago, and I watch it
Oh
now
wow,
and I'm just like, holy shit, how did this get made?
yeah.
Like even back,
The
even for the times it seems outdated, but so
it,
this is
it
like to a lesser extent at least.
Yeah. Now the 80s, like I said, the 80s were weird because it was like they were still getting away with a lot of that stuff. It just like you would think that it was far enough removed, but it really wasn't. I mean, and growing up during that time period, it was rampant. It's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of that anti-gay, um, very casual racism, um, loads of misogyny and stuff like that. I mean, you see it even in this movie with the misogyny in this. Um, it's weird. It's a weird thing to go back and look at this movie, especially if you haven't seen it in a while, or if you're
Mm-hmm.
just seeing it for the first time now. Um, then it's definitely a movie that um hasn't aged well fully. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's you have to give it somewhat of a pass just because of its time. And hope that people have grown since then to make better movies.
You would
um
hope at least.
yeah, but that's a pairing these two was a kind of interesting for me. Whenever I was coming up with the idea for this, was I wanted to have kind of, because both of these tackle um werewolf as puberty, almost in a way,
Mm-hmm.
lycanthropy as puberty in a way. It's um the changing your bodies and in your sexualities and everything, that but they take it from two different, one of course is through the male perspective, one's through the female perspective. um and one's more comedy and one's more straight up horror.
Yeah.
um and so I thought it was an interesting juxtaposition to pair these two, um, and and speak to those, because in Teen Wolf, we've got Scott, who's become a werewolf, but and his is legacy. His father's a werewolf, his family's a werewolf through time immemorial, from what it sounds like. It's a genetic quirk. And so, and then, sometimes it passes the generation. So he had the chance to not get it. And, but it, slammed right into him. And, he's a high school kid, although, Michael J. Fox at the time had to be in his mid to late 20s. So, yeah, as was a lot of teenage movies at that time. It was always people.
Oh,
in
they
their
still
20s.
do that now.
Yeah, true. True. I think they try a little bit to, go closer to, the teens with some of them these days. But but yeah, so I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting to see this, that perspective of, it's a definitely a metaphor. He's kind of an awkward dude. um he's got this girl who obviously like they're best friends, they grew up together. She's obviously in love with him, but he can't see that at all. He's totally in love with a girl that's, doesn't want to have anything to do with them. um and it's just it's a typical 80s kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's funny to watch it, but also kind of cringy now to watch it, just because it's just full of like the tropes that we see in a lot of movies of that time period, and
Yeah.
up to that time period. So
And it's first, I want to say that the best friend being in love with their friend is one of my least favorite tropes of all time.
yeah,
I hate it so much because it perpetuates this whole myth that opposite sex are not capable of just being friends. And I
just being
hate
friends.
that.
Yeah.
But aside from that, I do like I'll save my thoughts on Ginger Snaps, but it is interesting when you look at these two films because I think even the genres that they fall into, even though they're both werewolf horror films, I think the fact that Teen Wolf leans more into horror or into comedy is very indicative of what the experience of puberty is like for young men
Yes.
versus young women. Because
Yes.
when Scott's going through all these transformations, he's obviously, it's shocking for him at first, but he, like, everyone around him immediately accepts him. He immediately becomes like this amazing basketball player. He becomes the most
Yeah.
popular guy in school, and it's great for him. It's all these changes are improving his life overall, and he's having fun with it. And it's just that is, when we get to Ginger Snaps, that's obviously a very different experience in that film. So it is, I
Right.
do think it really speaks a lot to how different things are for men, young men, when they're in high school and they're going through all these changes. Obviously, it's not all positive for everyone, but
Right.
generally speaking, it's usually less traumatic for young men than it
Right.
is for young women.
Yeah.
So I do think that's
No.
interesting when you look at these two films, because like at their core, they're somewhat similar stories of puberty and werewolf transformation. And they even both take a biological approach to it more so than like a mystical supernatural approach.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
But it is so interesting just to see how different the experience is for Scott in this film compared to Ginger in Ginger Snaps.
Yeah. Yeah, no, exactly. Like once I happened upon, like, I was trying to think of something to pair Ginger Snaps with, and then I was like, okay, Teen Wolf sounds like a really good idea. And then once you watch them, you can really see the parallels a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
It's not super clear if you're not really paying attention, if you're kind of, looking at the surface of it. But like you said, yeah, the different ways that the male character has it than the female character, and how that changes them and their responses to it, the way that their life changes and everything. It's a fun double feature when you look at it that way.
Yeah,
um
for sure.
and the but that was something that, when watching Teen Wolf, you see that, he's popular. He can transform back and forth at will. He can control it. There's nothing like, now there is a bestial side to him that can come out when he's angry or upset, or or whatever. And it's an interesting message that they're trying to, to say in the movie too, is, that you've got to, that, kind of almost like, even as a man, you've got to keep your aggression in check. And so it's, you can't let the beast out, and if you do, there's consequences. And
Yeah,
so
for
I get
sure.
there is some positive messaging in this through, I don't want to say this, this movie is terrible in any way, because it's not. There's a lot of there's a lot of questionable, and even then questionable, um, material in it, messaging in it. But overall, I think that, at the end of the day, what it's trying to tell you, like trying to tell the audience, is like, you know, you can be this kind of person, but that doesn't define you.
Yeah.
Um,
I think that also helps to have his dad in there for comparison as well,
yeah,
because
yeah,
he, at first, when he goes through this transformation and he's becoming this great athlete and stuff, he really plays into the whole, like you mentioned, the aggression and the macho bravado and stuff like that. But then you have his dad, who is like the most adorable little like house dad kind of character, and he just seems so like kind-hearted and happy all the time, and it's because he's learned to just kind of accept things as they are, and kind of keep that aggression in check. So
right,
it's almost a glimpse into what could happen. You don't have to feed into that aggressive side of yourself. You can learn to just kind of like accept things as they are, and move on without letting your emotions take over.
right,
So I love
exactly.
having the two of them there, seeing someone who's at the beginning of this transformation compared to someone who's lived with it for decades and has learned to live with that side of him and embrace it, while also making sure that he's not putting others in harm's way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I like their relationship as well. That's a nice thing with the movie, is they have a fairly decent father son relationship. I mean, obviously Scott, bristles and wants to kind of break away and be his own person and everything, but by the end he realizes that, his father just loves him and wants him to be, the best he can be, the best person he can be. um and as a father myself, I can recognize that. That's what I want with, for my kids, is just, I want to be a good dad, and I want them to be, good kids, and good adults, and be the best that they can be, and try to guide them, with whatever advice and everything that I can. And I think that, that's portrayed pretty well in the movie.
Yeah, and it's also normal. I like that they show how normal it is to kind of want to break away from the expectations of your family and not wanting to kind of having that rebellious side, because I think probably every teenager has had that rebellious side where they've gone against what their parents want of them,
Yeah,
and so it's, even though we see this on an accelerated timeline,
yeah,
obviously
yeah.
most kids don't go through that and it ends in just like a month or two. I'm not even sure how
Right.
long this movie is supposed to take place in, but it's a pretty quick turnaround.
Yeah.
So we see that on an accelerated rate, but it is something that most teenagers go through, where they kind of go through that rebellious stage and they rebel against what their parents want. But then eventually they usually come around and kind of realize, even if you don't necessarily agree with everything your parents say, you understand that they want what's best for you.
Right. And then we briefly touched on it, the relationship between Scott and his best friend Boof. That what an 80s name too.
I
That's
know.
Boof.
It's so awful.
But it's as much as I agree with you about the relationship, and about, it's we should be able to normalize more male female friendships that don't involve any kind of romantic aspect, or infatuation or anything like that. It is nice though, at the end of the movie, that he realizes that, that she's, you know been there for him all along, and that they can change their relationship in a positive way. um that it's kind of, pat and trite and everything like that, but it's kind of sweet at the end. So
Yeah. And I will say, like, even though I hate that trope, and it's something that is used today in films and books and stuff, and it always drives me crazy. But I do appreciate, because typically when we see that, it's usually the friend who is in love with their friend either doesn't get to be with that person or they die, depending on what type of media you're consuming. So it is nice to kind of see that Scott realizes that the popular girl that he wanted to be with really could not care less about him, only wants to be with him because of his popularity, didn't care about him before, still doesn't care about him. So that does show growth on his side. So I do at least appreciate that. Even though it's an obnoxious trope, it is used to show him maturing as a person.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I like about the movie too, is like, as much as he gains this, popularity and this adulation and everything from everybody else, and kind of pushes away, everybody, his father, his friends, he pushes away Styles and Booth and everything. They don't necessarily stick by him. They're just like, hey, when you get this out of your system, just know that we're still here. And once he does eventually get that out of his system, he repairs that. He doesn't just go back to them. He actually does the work of repairing those damaged friendships and relationships. And that is, it's very quick and minor, but you do see him try to repair that, rather than just all of a sudden everybody just comes back, oh yay, you're back to normal.
Yeah. It's definitely, like I said, everything's on an accelerated rate, but we kind of get this entire snapshot from his initial like change through puberty all the way through to him growing and basically becoming an adult and becoming what's a more emotionally mature person.
There you go. Yeah.
That's big now, emotional maturity.
No, and like, and I really enjoy that about the movie, that you get a full story like that, full character arc. You don't always get that in a lot of movies. You get pieces of character arcs and stuff, but you never get that full growth like that. And so that was it's quite nice to see that in a movie like this, especially something from the 80s, which a lot of times the 80s would kind of gloss over a lot of that stuff. So
for sure.
There's a neat little bit of trivia in this, is that the principal in this, whatever his name is, Thorne, he was in the original The Howling. Also, he's one of the newscasters in that movie. So from one werewolf movie to another, it was nice to see that. As I was watching these movies, I was like, wait a minute, that guy was in that. So
that's funny. See, and it's been so long since I've seen The Howling. I definitely need to rewatch that now just to see that. That's funny. I had no idea. See, and it's trivia that I had for this movie is that where they Scott's house in the movie is on the same block as, I think it's his mother's house in Back to the Future.
Oh, that's funny.
It's like on the same block. So it's kind of funny that he filmed two movies fairly close together in the same area.
That's really funny. Yeah, and I think they filmed them really fairly close together in time as well. So
yeah, got it film that quick to fill in for Eric Stoltz.
Yeah.
Poor guy. I always feel bad for him when I think about that.
Yeah. So I know that this movie was not a favorite of Michael J. Fox's. I guess he wasn't a big fan of it. I think probably over time he's become more okay with it, with the distance of time.
Yeah,
but
and I feel like a lot of actors don't love their horror origins. Like, I mean, granted, like we've said, this is a horror comedy. Like, it definitely leads more into the comedy than anything else. But I also think that he probably has a lot of fans that granted, probably most of his fans are from Back to the Future, but I think he probably has a subset of fans that love him specifically for this movie. And it probably helped a lot of kids when they were going through their own puberty time in their life. And it's nice when things can do that. And I think that it is something where, even with its flaws, you can look back on it and see the positive things in it. Like, it has, it's it has this goofiest werewolf makeup, but it's also
Yeah.
just, it's so fun to watch. Like when you first see the dad when he's transforms, that is one of my favorite scenes in the movie. He looks hilarious and so
It looks so
wholesome, even
funny.
though he's supposed to be a werewolf.
Yeah.
Just with his little bow tie and stuff, it's adorable. And that's one of the reasons why I think it ages well, because when you see Goofy, or at least the horror side of it ages well, maybe not so much the
Right.
comedy side, but when you see that kind of like practical effects, even though it's so ridiculous looking, it's still so fun to watch even now. And it's
Right.
something
Yeah.
that, like, if people wanted to do a cosplay for it or something, I feel like that would probably be pretty easy to do too.
Right. Yeah. Just stick a bunch of hair on you.
Exactly.
And wear a basketball jersey.
Yeah, I mean, just basically wear a Chewbacca costume and then put a basketball jersey on.
That's true. That's true. And maybe shave the face a little bit so
Yeah,
it's not as
just
furry.
a bit.
Yeah. I think it's funny though too that they ended up utilizing the basic concept of this and then turned it into like an MTV TV series. And I watched the first couple of seasons of that and it's really good. It's
Yes.
definitely different. It doesn't, it's more horror, and teen drama, more than than this movie was, for sure. They don't do as much of the comedy. There's definitely comedy in it, but
Yeah, mostly from Styles.
mostly from Styles, of
Yeah.
course.
I will say
It,
I was a big fan of the show. I watched all seasons, even the last couple seasons that like half the time I didn't understand what was going on. I still watched it. And it's so fun. And I like that it was a different take, and I like that they incorporated other creatures as well.
right. Yeah.
Like, I mean, my website is the Blogging Banshee, so having one of the main characters be a banshee, I was very excited about
Yeah.
because you don't normally see banshees in horror stuff,
Yeah.
except for Darby O'Gill and the Little People, which was another thing that scared me. But I haven't
It's
seen
not
the.
really
I
a
know
horror
that they
movie
had.
though.
Oh, that scene is absolutely terrifying, though. That
It's
alone would makes it a horror movie to me.
true, true, true.
With the young Sean Connery.
Yeah.
But it's just I do like that they kind of took little nuggets of the movie to make it into something modern for the show. And it's fun, and it's a way that I think that probably also brought a lot of new younger generations to look into the original Teen Wolf film and go back and watch that after realizing that the show was based on the movie.
Right.
So it probably
Yeah.
was a good way to bring new people to that film that would never have watched it otherwise.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I think especially having been so removed at that point, because the show came out, what, early 2000s or early 2010s.
Yeah, I think it
And
was
so
early 2010s. Yeah.
yeah, so it would have been, a good 20 years since, 20 plus years since the original Teen Wolf had come out. So it definitely, got some new younger eyes onto it. So I do not have anything else that I have to say about this movie. Unless you have anything to say, we can move on to Ginger Snaps.
Yeah, I think we've covered all of the good, the bad, and the ugly for that one.
All right. So jumping into Ginger Snaps, of course, this is one of your favorite movies. I enjoy it quite a lot. It's definitely not one of those that I've only seen it a couple of times. I've enjoyed it each time. It definitely is a unique take on werewolf uh, lore.
Mhm.
Um, it takes some liberties, and by doing that, it's doing that so that it's telling a very specific story in terms of puberty and growing up as girls and stuff like that. It's very particularly talking about that, which I thought was a fascinating and interesting take on it.
Yeah, it definitely. I mentioned this earlier with Teen Wolf. I like that they both took a more biological approach. And even though it's a hereditary thing in Teen Wolf, and it's still from a werewolf bite in Ginger Snaps, I do love how they it's basically a biological change. It's changing her from the inside out, very much like how puberty is. And the fact that she got bit virtually the exact same time that she got her first period. I think combining those to use that as a whole metaphor for her transformation and her going through puberty, it was such a smart way to do it. And I think that werewolf lore throughout time has kind of pointed to that kind of transformation, whether it be a puberty type transformation, or even sometimes it's been a way to denote like queer individuals and things like that. It's like it's so interesting to see all the different takes that we get on werewolf lore. And I like the more, even though I'm a fan of horror and I love supernatural horror, I love the biological aspect of it, because that's not something that you see as often with werewolves. It's almost always something mystical or something like that.
Curse,
so yeah. And so to see that, and even to have them reference that in the film when Bridget is trying to research werewolf lore, and it's all talking about the full moon and stuff like that, and that is not at all what's happening in this film, and I love that, because it kind of flips everything that people expect to happen on its head. And I also love that the transformation in this film is a permanent one, because it also kind of speaks like how Scott can turn his on and off whenever he wants. It also kind of speaks to, for young women, like once puberty happens, there's no hiding it.
There's no hiding it.
Yeah. It's not just what's inside that changes. It's also what's outside that changes, and our bodies change completely. And it's not something that can easily be hidden, and it's something that the entire world is going to see. And it's not something that we can change unless we do something surgically or something like that. So I do appreciate that side of it as well, because for Ginger, there's no going back once this happens. And that's really is how puberty is. Like once it happens, there's no going back.
Yeah.
So
I do. Yeah. No, I do think I think it's interesting, like you said, when they're researching the stuff about, the full moons and everything like that, because we associate this with lycanthropy, with becoming a werewolf, largely in most forms, like you said, as the curse. It's always a curse, and that is one of the aspects of female puberty is menstruation, and that it also has the term of the curse. And so it's interesting to combine those in this way. So it's really a fascinating look, like you said, of the biological, more than and kind of combining that the mythology and the female puberty in that way, that it's just it's just fascinating.
Yeah. And they're so cheeky with it too, because even one of the taglines for the film was "She's got the curse." And there's the very obvious double meaning there, which I love. And even when you think about it, even if it wasn't a permanent change like it was in this, like lycanthropy can be so easily connected to puberty and menstruation and stuff, because that's like a monthly cycle. And even if it was the kind of werewolf that changed with the moon, it's that monthly cycle. And there's always people saying that women's bodies are connected to the moon and stuff. There's just so many layers to it that makes it fit so well with this idea of young women going through puberty. And it's beautiful. I could gush about this film for hours.
I mean, it very fully fits into, and I'm sure you've done an article. I haven't read all your articles about it, but I'm sure you've done an article on uterus or about this. It was probably your first article about it.
It was actually the second one, but only because the first one was Carrie, because I believe that was the beginning of uterus horror. But yes, and that
makes a lot of sense.
Ginger Snaps is just, and there's so much intent behind it too. I had the opportunity to interview the screenwriter Karen Walton, who's amazing. Okay. And just hearing her talk about this and the inspiration and the way that she just wanted to really convey what it's like for these young women while also combining the horror elements. And it is also fascinating too. Like I alluded to this earlier, but with Scott, everything came so easily, like I mentioned before. But then when you watch Ginger, the entire process is horrific.
Painful.
Like,
it's painful. It's horrific.
There's
Yeah.
pain and blood and hair and your body changing and all these things but at the same time, they also really point to something that they talk about a bit in Teen Wolf too, is the sexual lure also.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
she's going through this change where she feels horrible all the time, but at the same time, the outside world is perceiving her as the sexual
Now desirable.
object.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's another interesting juxtaposition too, because she fights it for so long, but then in the moments when you see her kind of embrace the changes she's going through, she like that scene where she struts down the hall.
The hallway scene. Yep.
Yeah. And it's such an iconic scene. And you see it's like it's been copied a million times before. Like obviously we saw pretty much the same scene in like Jennifer's Body and stuff. And it's just, and then the moment when she's like even further into her transformation and she goes to the Halloween bash and stuff, she understands that she has this sexual power now, especially the sexual power over men. And she embraces it, even though inside she's like torn apart by all these changes she's going through. So it's really interesting to watch her balance those two sides of herself as well. It's like the animal instinct versus her disdain for being normal. And it's
what,
even though turning into a werewolf isn't normal, like it's when you think of it for the metaphor for puberty, she doesn't want to be just a normal girl. She's goth, she's an outsider. She doesn't want to be a part of that. But at the same time, by becoming a werewolf, she's obviously very far removed from what is normal.
Yeah. And I there's, talking about that, the first hallway strut or the hallway strut and everything like that. She's got that, she's turning all the heads and everything. And then when she gets into the Halloween party, it's a different aspect too, because she's definitely there to turn heads, but at that point she's a predator. It's a different situation than it is in the earlier hallway one, because in the earlier hallway one, it's an embrace of just the minor. She's like, okay, I've been going through all this pain, but people are perceiving me different now, so I'm going to embrace that. And then later when she's like transforming even more and looks more animal like and everything, it then has become this predator mode for her, which is an interesting thing too. And she's still turning heads and everything. She's really trying to, that people are attracted to her and like coming to her and everything. And she's out for the kill at that point, which I found interesting.
Even when she has like her visible wolf teats going on, there are still people that are looking at her like, wow, she's amazing. I want to know this person.
Yeah, exactly. I it's a fun, because we're talking about this, but also there's this this other aspect of this, which is the sisters, her and Bridget. They are trying to deal with this together, both of them. At the beginning of the movie, neither one of them has started their period. They're both kind of late bloomers, and they've embraced this this weird, like, I don't even know how to say it, but they're both obsessed with death, and taking pictures of themselves in all these horrible situations and everything. And it's an interesting, like, they're very, very goth. They lean fully into that goth stereotype, and and that's how they kind of just deal with their lives at that point. They're obviously the weird girls at school, and before the attack and all this transformation and stuff, that it's a interesting dynamic between them, because once Ginger starts to change, Bridget's trying to save her and trying to figure out how to get her back, because that's what
Mhm.
she wants. She wants her sister back. And it's this, and I haven't seen the sequels yet. I do want to watch them, but I haven't seen them, so I don't know how their relationship changes or grows or anything accordingly. But
Well,
it's
spoiler alert for people who haven't seen the first Ginger Snaps. I mean, Ginger dies at the end of
yes,
it,
yeah,
so
yeah,
but it's I've obviously I've seen all the sequels. I own all of them, and I love them as well. And it is interesting too, because when you watch this, when you see, because we're seeing everything essentially through Bridget's eyes, even though it's
yeah,
Ginger's story and we're watching her transformation, it's all from Bridget's point of view. And so I think
right,
we're kind of getting this combination of um seeing the difference between how Ginger's behavior changes and things like that when she starts going through puberty. And at the same time, we're seeing Bridget, even though she knows that there's the werewolf side of things, I think that there is a fear for her that this is the who she's going to become as well.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and that
exactly.
is actually something that carries over a bit into the second one too, where she's even though at the end of the first film she infects herself with Ginger's blood, so we know that she has the lycanthrope virus or whatever it
Yeah,
is.
the
Um,
curse as well.
yeah, she in the second film, it's also a lot about her trying to be a different person than Ginger. Even as she's going
Okay,
through the same transformation, she's distancing herself, like, I am not my sister, I am a different person. And that's one of
okay,
the things I also that really drew me to this film is the relationship between the sisters.
right,
I mean,
yeah,
I have an older sister. She's 9 years older than me. We've never been particularly close because of the age gap. It's almost
the
like
age
having two
difference.
only children.
Yeah,
But so I mean, part of me when I watch that, I see how accurate the relationship between the sisters is, but at the same time, it's something that I also envy because I've never had that real closeness.
right,
Um, but it's I think it's so interesting watching that because I think it's something that a lot of men don't realize how close relationships between teenage girls are and how volatile it can be, even though you still love the person. It can
right,
also be so vicious. So
right.
the way they depicted that in this film is just so perfectly well done. And I also highly recommend. I mean, I recommend all three films, but especially the second one because you do see a very similar journey, but it's with Bridget. It's just it feels less, even though it's still the biological change. It feels less connected to puberty and more connected to her becoming her own person. And also, like, I interpret it, I obviously with horror films you can interpret them a million different ways. But
Right.
with the second film, I very much interpret it not only as Bridget becoming her own person and learning to be someone separate from Ginger, but also I believe it's her kind of discovering her sexuality as well, because I firmly believe that Bridget is a lesbian. And I think that
Okay.
it plays into that more in the second film.
Okay.
But yeah, it's just I their relationship is so important to this journey, and you can imagine how different this would be for Ginger if she didn't have Bridget, despite her constantly berating Bridget and making fun of her and being vicious and volatile towards her. She probably would have cracked a lot sooner if she didn't have that support system there that she could be completely open and honest with, and that was there for her no matter what.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's great to have that familial tie, but it's Bridget is such an amazing character in this, and I I also just love both Catherine Isabel and Emily Perkins together in this film. They actually feel like real sisters to me watching that.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely. It's funny too because Emily Perkins, speaking about her, I hadn't seen Ginger Snaps until the last couple of years. That was the first time I ever saw it. And so seeing Emily Perkins in this it was interesting because I'd seen her in other stuff that had come out after this. So I'd seen her in this movie, She's the Man, where she's playing this real
Oh yeah.
geeky, awkward girl. Hilarious. She's hilarious in that movie,
Yeah. And she
but
actually she
completely
plays a
different.
similar character in Supernatural as well.
Yes, and that was the other place was in Supernatural where I saw her. I was like, okay, so she plays a similar character to that. So then going back and having seen this, I was like, oh, this is a much different. Like, and,
Yeah.
it's great, actors doing this, but it was just one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, this is the same actress. That's so crazy.
Yeah. So had you
Um,
not seen the It miniseries?
and I have seen the It
Oh,
miniseries, but
okay.
I saw it as a kid, and I don't
Yeah.
believe I've seen it since. And so I didn't recognize her. It wasn't until I saw pictures of her and saw that she was in that. I was like, oh, okay. I didn't even realize that was her also. So yeah, it was it was
Which
just
is
more
also funny because that's another uterus horror thing. So
exactly, yeah,
she's in a lot of these types of movies, which I appreciate, and which is one of the reasons why I love her so much.
yeah. And Catherine Isabel, of course, I she's a certified scream queen as well. She was in this. She was in Freddy versus Jason, Bones. So she was in a lot of stuff around that time period, a lot of horror centric
Mm-hmm.
stuff. I'm not sure if she's doing much horror these days, but it is talking about actors who have done horror and kind of moved on from that. I spoke about this recently on another episode where I really appreciate the actors and actresses who have embraced that horror side of their acting, continue to seek it out and continue to champion it, because there are so many actors who use it just as a stepping stone, and I don't blame them at all either.
Mm-hmm.
There's lots of people who use it just as a stepping stone to do other work, because it's easy to get into a horror movie and then move on. But it's I always appreciate it more when you see an actor or an actress who embraces that. Somebody like Barbara Crampton or Kyle Gallner or somebody like those people who really embrace that aspect of it and really try to champion it and push it forward by doing as much as
Mm-hmm.
they can. So,
Yeah, and I think that as far as I'm aware, I think Catherine Isabel still does some horror. I think she just does a
right.
lot more indie stuff. Like I mean, this was still a while ago. Like
Yeah.
she was in American Mary.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think recently, I think I remember seeing on her
I thought
Instagram
she
that
was in something. Yeah.
yeah, I think she was in some kind of horror film that like took place in Ireland or something like that. I can't remember the details, but
Right.
and it's something that I think both of them really understand that this film specifically was very vital, not just for their
Yes.
careers but also for the community as a whole.
Right. Yeah.
I've heard both of them talk about it before, and I know Emily Perkins' husband even wrote a book about the making of the film, so like
Oh
clearly he's
wow.
a fan as well.
Yeah.
So it's I think that they whether they continue to do horror, they still understand that this film was such an important piece of horror history as well as their own
Right.
personal acting history, and they really embrace that, which I definitely appreciate.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I'm even if somebody moves on and does other stuff, it's nice that when something means so much, like especially something like this, that it definitely has, like you said, it's definitely, it has a message about you know what it's trying to say about female puberty and growing up and sisterhood and all this. It's a good message movie, and not something that's like really trying to, and again, this is what I think is great about horror movies in general, is that horror can take what could be a simple story or a story that could be a heavy-handed message, and because you can tell it through this lens of horror, you can make it more interesting and more fun,
Mm-hmm.
than something that would otherwise be bland or boring. So
I also think what's great about this is that this is kind of a weird way to put it, but it almost makes a story of young women going through puberty more palatable for a wider audience. Like,
right.
because
Yeah.
obviously there's a lot of period talk in this film, and it's
Yeah.
something, because it's in conjunction with the lycanthropy side of things, I think that it makes it so a lot more men would still watch this film and be interested in it. Which, I mean, they should watch stuff like this anyways, but it is, I think that it definitely makes it so that it's something that more audiences can watch. But it still is very much telling the story of young women. And it's, even now, there isn't enough horror that's telling that story. We're seeing more of it. Like I said, like when you think about uterus horror, like Harry, I think, was definitely like the first definitive film that was telling that story. But Ginger Snaps was for sure what brought about the resurgence of it, because that was back in the 70s. And then we get like some films that you can interpret that way. But it wasn't until this was the first one that really was like, hey, this is the story we're telling. This is an important story. It's not going to be for everyone, but it's a story that needs to be told.
Right. No, I agree with you. I think that, again, I think that, telling these stories through a lens, either horror or some other way that can be, palatable for those who might not appreciate it otherwise, I think is always, good. Even with comedies and stuff like that, we get a lot of, maybe, the occasional like raunchy comedy and stuff like that might be telling a better story, that like, there's a message in there about whatever. If we get stuff like that is going towards that and can make people think and appreciate aspects that maybe don't pertain to them necessarily, like this. As a man, I'm not going to fully understand all the context of what's going on in Ginger Snaps, unless I have already known and already have enough information about women's sexuality and puberty and stuff like that, that it's just not something that I'm going to know. But the more you're exposed to that, I think that it gives you an understanding and empathy towards other people who you might not otherwise know. So it's good to step out of that box and watch stuff like this.
For sure. And that's something too, where I think historically, cishet white men specifically haven't had to take a look at things like this and kind of put themselves in someone's shoes. Whereas women and queer people and people of color have been doing that for decades, since the dawn of film.
Well, so the irony of all that is too, the funny thing about it is, because I am a cishet, white man. I'm 100%, that demographic that, everybody is catered to. We are the blandest freaking demographic. I mean, it's ridiculous. We are the most normal, like zero, like it's just, why not expand your horizons out? Like that's what, for me as a person, like I'm more interested in that. Like they cater to my demographic all the time. There's plenty of movies out there in the world, plenty of TV shows out there in the world that I could go watch and enjoy that kind of stuff if I want something, maybe not bland, but something just generic, just the normal speed, but to watch something like this, or to watch something with people of color or queer aspects or whatever, that's more interesting, because it does talk about things that are, in a context that I don't know of, and that's why I like talking to people on my show that are, I try to heavily have guests who are women, people of color, and queer, because they will bring different perspectives that I won't have. And so that, because I mean, if it's just me and another cishet white dude, then, we're just talking about the same things. So it's always nice to have some kind of different perspective on that. And, that's what I like to seek out in general. So.
Yeah. And I love that even when you're looking at a different perspective, there's still going to be something in there that you can relate to.
Yeah.
Like
Absolutely.
Inevitably, there's something that you're gonna be like, wow, I've been through something like that too. I never realized that someone else was going through the same kind of thing that I was going through. So
Exactly.
I love having, and even with this film, I mean, I even just yesterday I was talking to someone about this film and how we were interpreting it in different ways. And that's another thing that's great about horror in general, but also these kinds of puberty type films, is that people with different experiences will pull out different aspects of it and be able to really relate to it and connect it to their own story, and feel so connected to this film. Like I felt connected to this film since I first saw it, not only initially because of the basic puberty aspects of it and being kind of the weird outsider girl.
Right.
But then as I've gotten older, there have been other things that I've pulled from it, and just like Ginger's experiences I feel so connected to it because of health issues that I've had throughout my life, and that are connected, unfortunately, to me having a uterus.
Right.
So it's having that, it's great how you can connect to it because of the things that you went through as a kid, but then there are still things that you can be like, wow, that really relates to things that I'm experiencing now as well. And it's so your point of view towards it evolves over time as well, which is also, I think, such a beautiful thing about film in general, but I think horror especially, just because there's usually a lot more metaphor going on.
Right. Yeah, no, like I said, with horror, you can tell these, what would be a normal, just kind of down the middle of the road kind of story, and give it some flavor that makes it more interesting, and can take it down roads that you might not go down otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
So it's always good. And again, it can tell stories that just can't be done otherwise.
100%. Yep.
All right. Do you have anything else specific that you want to mention about Ginger Snaps, but before we conclude?
I mean, like I said, I could talk about this film nonstop all day, every day. I also, just because I want to show that I'm a balanced person, I will say one and a half things negative about it.
Okay. All right.
Just to show that I'm not being completely biased. The film as a whole is great. There's one scene when Bridget finds I think his name was Jason, like attacking the little trick-or-treater kid or whatever. That scene, I understand its importance because of her trying to use the monk's hood cure on him, and having kind of him being a guinea pig. I understand the importance of it. It looks like an episode of Goosebumps. That's every time I see it, I'm like, this looks like it was filmed the same way an episode of Goosebumps was filmed. And also Bridget's wig in this is awful.
That's funny.
One of the worst wigs I've ever seen, and you actually see it fall forward at one point in the film also.
I'll have to rewatch to catch that. That's funny.
It's when towards the end of the film, in the climax, when she like kind of gets dizzy and falls down the stairs a little bit, the wig goes like halfway up her forehead.
Oh geez.
It's bad. And they had to do it because she had shaved her head for something else.
Okay, I gotcha.
But it was kind of a Sarah in the Craft situation, where the same thing happened there, where she had shaved her head, and they were like, oh shit, we got to get a wig ASAP. But I think a bit of trivia, I think she like was worried she almost didn't get the role, because when she auditioned, she had her head shaved, and she was concerned that was going to be an issue. But then, of course, as soon as they saw the chemistry between her and Catherine Isabel, they were like, nope, you two are perfect. You are sisters. We're going to do this.
That's funny.
And also, just another bit of trivia, I think that this is also an interesting snapshot in time, because the release of this did get delayed because it was supposed to be released right around when Columbine happened.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And so they were concerned that having these death obsessed teens and a high school setting with a lot of death and stuff, that was not the right time to release it, which I get.
Yeah, I understand that.
But I also think that this is something that probably could have spoken to a lot of teens going through a lot of stuff during that time as well. So I see both sides of it. I get why they delayed it, but I also don't necessarily think it was absolutely necessary.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I do think the werewolf, the talking about the werewolf, the transformation of her getting to the werewolf stage was interesting because as we said with with Teen Wolf, he could change back and forth, and he was just kind of like a hairy dude.
Hmm.
There was no real, there was no real like you know wolfness to him outside of just being hairy.
Yeah.
Um, that with her though, she was transforming into like going full on from human to wolf, no back and forth. Like it was just the transformation totally into the eventual wolf form, which was a to me is a very weird like wolf form.
See, and it's
um
I this is a point of contention with a lot of people. I actually love the werewolf in this.
yeah,
Partly because I love that they went full practical with it.
yeah, no, I
I
do
always
agree, I like
appreciate
the
that.
practice. Yeah,
But I think that if you take into consideration that this is like again the biological process, it
right.
doesn't make sense that she would transform and immediately be covered in hair. You know what I
No,
mean? So
yeah,
so having
exactly.
her have that kind of like gross wet skin look
Yeah,
it's I think it feels more accurate to the story that's told in this, and that's also something that they they don't directly address in the other two films, but in the other two films the werewolves that we see are covered in hair, but that's also because they've been werewolves for longer.
right.
So
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I
because
think
she
that's
hasn't fully transformed. Yeah,
exactly, like she just turned into a werewolf. It's going to take some time for her hair to grow in,
right,
especially since they showed over and over again her constantly like shaving it all off, trying to keep that side of her at bay.
right,
So I think in other movies it wouldn't have worked so well, but I think
right.
for the purpose of this film
For
with
the story they were
the
telling. Yeah,
yeah, it works so well. And then it's I think by having showing the hairy werewolves in the sequel and then the prequel, I think that kind of ties everything together nicely and shows that it's she's not going to look like, if she had lived past that time, she wouldn't have looked
right,
like that forever. She would have eventually like grown in the hair and stuff. It was just like, and I think that she almost kind of looks like a gross little newborn
right.
because
Yeah,
she's so like slimy and hairless. Um,
right.
and I
No, and
think
I
that
didn't have a problem with that. I just, it was it's such an interesting, like, like you said, kind of a gross look, that's
yeah,
the sliminess and everything like that. So it's an interesting aspect of it that, does continue along that path of, transformation. Like she hasn't fully transformed yet. So,
yeah. And those scenes in when we just see flashes of her in the back of the van when she starts to really transform are so disgusting, but
yeah,
in the best way. And again, that speaks to puberty. Puberty is absolutely disgusting and it's
yeah,
awful.
yeah,
So it's just, it works so well. I just,
yeah.
like I said, I don't get me started because I won't stop.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking both of these movies with me. I'm very happy to talk to you, especially about Ginger Snaps. But but let people know where they can find you online and what
Yeah.
you're working on currently.
Uh, you can find me on Twitter at blogging banshee, and everywhere else it's at Molly Henry. There is an extra E in my last name. It's Henery. That always throws people off. Um, I guess I just keep an eye out on Certified Forgotten for my monthly uterus horror columns. There's the queer horror guide that you mentioned earlier. I don't know for sure when that's being published. I know it's still going through the editing phase, but as soon as I know an official date, I will post that, obviously. But yeah, and just keep an eye on mostly Certified Forgotten and bloggingbanshee.com, where you'll find most of my reviews.
Sounds great. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I am always happy to talk about werewolf films.
All right. Good to know. Thanks again to Molly for joining me. Next episode, Rob Salcedo joins me to talk about Silver Bullet and Cursed. Thanks for listening. If you like what you've heard, please please consider giving the show 5 stars and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, please share the podcast on social media to help spread the word. Make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app or at creepyandgeeky.com. Music for the podcast composed by Jerry Smith. You can follow the podcast on social media at Creepy and Geeky on both Twitter and Instagram. If you'd like to follow me, I'm GeekThulu on Twitter and geek.thulu on Instagram. You can support the podcast by donating to the Ko-fi page. All of the links are in the show notes. Finally, don't forget, stay creepy.